If you've been looking for a Christian podcast about healing, faith, and identity, especially in the parts of your life that feel a little harder to explain, you're in the right place. Today, I want to talk about something that I didn't even realize was happening. There's been something happening lately while I've been recording these episodes that I don't think I would have noticed a year or two ago. It's not something you can see from the outside. If you were just listening, you might not catch it at all, but I can feel it. There are moments while I'm speaking, especially when I start to say something that feels more honest than I would normally say out loud, where my body reacts before my mind can fully catch up. My chest tightens, my heart rate picks up, and sometimes I can feel myself getting a little flushed, like my body's trying to decide if what I'm doing is safe at all. And the interesting part is, nothing is actually happening. I'm sitting in a quiet room, talking into a microphone. There's no one here reacting, no one interrupting, no one disagreeing, and still my body responds as if something important is at risk. And this has been getting my attention lately, because it has made me realize that some of what feels unfamiliar to me right now isn't just about learning to speak differently. It's about realizing how much of me was shaped before I ever had language for it. How much of what I thought was just who I am might actually be something I learned without even realizing I was learning it. And I think that's what I want to talk about today. Not the ways that we consciously change ourselves to belong, but the ways belonging shapes us long before we understand what's even happening. I think that one of the clearest ways I can see this in my own life is in something that on the surface feels really simple: hosting. We all know the people who love to host. Their homes always seem ready. They enjoy having people over. It doesn't feel like a production for them. And for the longest time, I just assumed that was something that I should be able to do too. Not because anybody told me I had to, but because it seemed like that's what people who are good at relationships do. So every once in a while, I would try to become that person. And every single time, it felt much like a much bigger deal than it probably should have been. Because for me, hosting isn't just opening the door and letting people in. It's cleaning before they come, thinking through every detail, making sure everything feels right, and then cleaning again once they leave. And by the time it's all done, I'm exhausted. Not from the people, because I love the people, but from everything it took to be the version of me I thought I needed to be in that moment. I remember volunteering to host a Bible study about a year or two ago, thinking, I can do this. This is something that I should be able to do. And I did it for a few weeks, 3 or 4, I think, before I hit a point where it just became too overwhelming and I had to hand it off to someone else. And of course, it was fine. Everything continued and nothing fell apart. But internally, it felt like I had failed at something that I was supposed to be able to carry, like I wasn't quite that girl. And the truth is, I'm not. I think that I'm finally starting to say that without the attaching shame to it. But that idea of I should be able to do this like everyone else shows up in other ways too. I felt it recently in a stretch of time that on paper probably doesn't look like a big deal. We had a wedding on a Sunday, a few normal days, and then multiple gatherings stacked together: Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, and then another one right after that. And for someone who loves being around people and gets energy from it, that might sound full and good. But for me, it's a lot. That's a lot of peopling in a very short amount of time. And what most people don't see is what it takes for me to show up in those spaces. The way I start preparing for it days ahead of time. The way I know I'm going to need quiet before and after just to manage it. The way that it takes time for me to recover, even when I'm genuinely enjoying being there because I love these people. Not going isn't really an option, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't cost something. I think for, or I, and I think that for a long time, I interpreted that cost as something being wrong with me, like I should be wired differently, like I should be more naturally social, more energized by it, more like the people who seem to move through these environments so easily. And I'm realizing now that what I was doing in those moments wasn't just trying to function, I was quietly trying to become a version of myself that I thought made more sense in the world around me. And I didn't even know I was doing it. I think part of what made this so hard to recognize is that so much of what people experienced around me or about me was actually true. I have always been someone who listens well, who I care deeply about people, and I don't just hear what someone is going through, I tend to feel it with them. That empathy has shaped so many of my relationships in ways that I genuinely value, and I wouldn't want to lose that part of who I am. The same can be true of the way that I work. I'm I've always been able to take an idea and build something around it. Give me something conceptual and I will find a way to organize it, structure it, and bring it to life. That part of me, that one that loves systems and details, has been steady for a long time. So when people describe me in those ways, it feels accurate, it feels familiar, and it fits. But there are other words that people have used over the years that have always been a little harder for me to receive. Words like strong, or brave, or even smart. On the surface, those should land as compliments, but for me, they often hit something deeper that I've had to untangle over time. Because underneath all of that, there's been this long standing belief that I was wrong. Not just occasionally wrong, but that something about the way I see things, the way I feel things, doesn't quite line up the way it should. And when that belief is reinforced over and over again, especially in the formative years, it starts to shape more than just your confidence. It shapes how you show up. You don't just second guess what you say, you start to question whether you should say anything at all. And I think that's where some parts of me never fully developed. Not because I didn't have thoughts or opinions or preferences, but because anything that might create tension or require explanation or even open the door for disagreement just felt like it was more than it was worth. It wasn't a conscious decision to hold things back. It just became an easier way to exist in the spaces that I was in. Over time, that creates a version of you that people experience as easygoing, agreeable, and even peaceful. And again, that's not untrue. There is a real part of me that does want to keep things calm and connected and steady, but that isn't the whole picture either. Because what was missing wasn't personality, it was expression. It was the ability to say in real time, I see this differently, or this is what I need, or even something as simple as, no, that doesn't really work for me. I don't think that I fully recognized that until more recently when I started noticing this gap between what I was thinking and what I was actually saying. I could sit in a conversation and have very clear thoughts internally, and still, by default, I would go to something softer or more agreeable or a more neutral, thing to say externally. For a time, I assumed that was just who I was. I was someone without a strong preference or someone who didn't feel the need to push back. I thought I was naturally easygoing, and I'm starting to realize now that it may have not been that simple. That some of what I thought was just my personality may have actually been a version of me shaped by what felt safest in the environments in which I grew up. I think where this has become the most noticeable for me is in real time conversations. It's one thing to notice and recognize after the fact that you had thoughts or feelings you didn't express. That's something that I've probably done my whole life without really thinking about it. But it's a different experience to start noticing it while it's happening and you still feel like you can't quite close the gap between what you're thinking and what actually comes out of your mouth. For me, those two things have not always worked together very well in the moment, especially when emotions are involved. I can process something deeply. I can sit with it. I can think through it. And I can even explain it clearly later. But when I'm in conversation where something matters, where there is a potential for tension or misunderstanding, or even the possibility that what I might say might not land well, it's like the system simply moves ahead of me and defaults to something that feels safer. And what comes out in those moments is usually softer than what I'm actually thinking, more agreeable, more neutral, Sometimes it even sounds like agreement when internally I know that I don't fully agree at all. I've seen that pattern show up in a lot of different ways over time. There have been conversations I avoided altogether because I didn't feel equipped to handle them in real time. There have been moments where I waited until much later to say something once I had time to process it and make sure it wouldn't come across in the wrong way. And there have been times where I chose to write something instead of saying it out loud because writing gave me space to think and edit and be more careful with how it might be received. And even then, it didn't always go in the way that I hoped. So eventually, it just felt easier not to bring certain things up at all. And when that happens over and over again, it starts to feel like a pattern and less like a pattern and more like a personality. It becomes something you explain about yourself instead of something you question. You tell yourself, I'm just not someone who speaks up in the moment, or I'm not good at confrontation, or this just isn't how I'm wired. And maybe there are parts of that are true. Personality does play a role in how we communicate and how we respond in different situations. But I'm starting to see that there is also a difference between what comes naturally and what has been conditioned. Because when I look back, there are a lot of moments growing up where expressing how I felt or what I thought didn't go well. It didn't seem to matter how much I said something or how carefully I tried to explain it, it was still just received as wrong. And when that happens consistently, you don't learn to be thoughtful with your words, you learn to protect yourself. Not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in every subtle, almost automatic way where your system starts making decisions before you even realize what's happening. It learns to keep things contained, avoid escalation, and to stay in the safest possible version of the conversation. And I think that's why, even now, in environments that are healthier and more supportive, there is still a moment of hesitation, that pause, that internal check that happens before I speak, where my body reacts before the mind has fully stepped in to remind me that I'm not in that same place anymore. And what has been especially interesting is seeing how much this shows up, even in something as simple as a podcast, because this has become one of the first places where I'm actively choosing to say things out loud that I might have filtered before. I'm taking thoughts that I would have softened or reshaped or kept to myself entirely and giving them space to exist without editing them down into something that's more comfortable. And even there, or here, where there is no one responding in real time, it can still feel like I can still feel that internal resistance. I notice it in my body before I fully notice it in my thoughts. That tightness in the chest, the shift in my breathing, the subtle tense that crosses the subtle sense that crosses into something that feels more honest than what I would have said a few years ago. And it has made me realize that this isn't just about learning how to communicate differently, it's about learning how to trust what is true in me can actually be spoken without everything falling apart. I think what's been challenging for me lately isn't that I've suddenly become someone who always speaks up or always knows exactly what to say in the moment. That's not what this looks like at all. If anything, it's been much smaller than that and a lot more subtle. It has looked more like noticing when moments where I would normally default into silence start questioning that instinct. There have been times where I've caught myself thinking, is this actually what I want to say, or is this just what I've always done? And the answer isn't always clear right away. But the fact that I'm even asking the question feels new. Sometimes I still choose not to say anything, but other times I'm beginning to say just a little bit more than I would have before. Not perfectly and not fully formed, and not without feeling it in my body while I'm doing it. But there's still a physical response sometimes that tightens in my chest or that quick shift in breathing, but I'm learning not to take that as a sign that I shouldn't speak and start seeing it more as a sign that I'm doing something unfamiliar. And I think that that's been an important distinction for me because for so long, unfamiliar felt unsafe. If something didn't feel natural or easy, I assumed it meant that I shouldn't be doing it at all. But now I'm realizing that unfamiliar may actually be where the growth is happening. Part of that shift has also come from recognizing that the relationships in my life now are not the same as the ones that shaped me when I was younger. I have people around me who love me, who are for me, and who are capable of hearing me even when we don't see things the same way. That doesn't mean every conversation is easy, and it doesn't mean there won't be moments of misunderstanding, but it does mean that I'm not navigating those situations from the same place that I once was. And that has forced me to be honest about something that I haven't considered before, which is that I can't expect people to know me if I'm not actually letting them see me. If I've spent years softening everything, filtering everything, and holding back parts of me that might create tension, then it makes sense that showing up differently now would feel like a shift for everyone involved. It also makes sense that there might be moments where I feel misunderstood, but I'm starting to see that misunderstanding doesn't automatically mean something has gone wrong. Sometimes it just means something is new, and people are adjusting to a version of me that they haven't fully experienced yet. And that's been uncomfortable at times because I would much rather things feel smooth and easy. But I'm also realizing that being understood at the expense of being honest isn't really the same as being known. And I don't want to keep living in that space. I want to be able to say, this is what I need, even if it takes me a minute to find the words. And I want to be able to express preferences without immediately trying to soften them into something more acceptable. And I want to be able to participate in relationships in a way that allows both people to show up honestly, not just one person adapting to keep things steady. For me, that has also started to show up in very practical ways, especially in how I think about structure and expectations. I realize that I function best when things are thought through ahead of time, when there's a plan in place, when I'm not trying to navigate something at the last minute that could have been prepared for earlier. For a long time, I would absorb the stress of those situations instead of naming what would have actually helped. I would adjust to whatever is happening, even if it left me feeling overwhelmed or behind. But I'm starting to understand that communicating those needs isn't demanding or being difficult. It's actually a way of creating an environment where I can show up well. And I think that that's where this starts to feel less like learning to speak up and more like learning to be honest about who I am. Not in a way that creates unnecessary tension, but in a way that creates clarity. Because when there's clarity, there's less room for resentment, less room for confusion, and more space for people to actually work together in a way that honors how they're wired. It's still something I'm learning, and I don't always get it right, but I can feel the shift happening. And for the first time, it feels like I'm not trying to become someone else. I'm starting to understand who I already am. I think that what this has been teaching me more than anything is that discovering who you are isn't always about becoming something new. Sometimes sometimes it's about recognizing that what you thought was just you was shaped over time in ways that you didn't fully see while they were happening. And that doesn't make it fake and that doesn't make it wrong. It just means that it wasn't the whole story. Because when I look at my life now, I can see that there are parts of me that have always been there. The way I care about people, the way I listen, the way I tend to hold space for what someone else is carrying, those things are real and they matter. They are not something that I need to undo or replace, but I can also see that there are parts of me that didn't have the same space to grow. Not because they weren't there, but because they didn't feel safe to express. And now, as I've started doing more of this work, these parts of me are beginning to surface in ways that feel unfamiliar, even when they're honest. That unfamiliarity has been one of the harder things to navigate because for a long time I equated unfamiliar with wrong. If something didn't feel natural or easy, I assumed that it meant I was stepping outside of who was supposed to be. But I'm starting to understand that unfamiliar can also mean something is finally being given room to exist. And that changes how I see the process. It's less about fixing something and more about allowing something. Less about trying to become a different version of myself and more about giving myself permission to be more fully who I already am, even if I'm still discovering what that looks like in real time. There are still moments where I hesitate, where I fall back into what feels easier or safer, especially when something matters or when I can sense that what I'm about to say might not land perfectly. But those moments don't feel as defining as they once did. They feel more like part of the process, something I'm learning to move through instead of something that determines who I am. And I think that's where this connects back to my faith in a way that feels steady, because I don't have to fully understand myself in order for God to know me completely. He isn't discovering me piece by piece in the way that I am. He already sees the full picture, including the parts of me that are still growing, still healing, and still finding their voice. There's something deeply comforting in that, because it means I don't have to rush to become a finished version of myself. I don't have to force clarity where it hasn't formed yet, and I can let it unfold at a pace that is actually sustainable. And maybe that's what belonging really is. Not becoming who you think you need to be in order to be accepted, but realizing you are already known, already seen, and already held just as you are, even while you're still learning what that means for you. If this conversation resonated with you, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to a couple of episodes that connect to this one. Episode 20, Why You Can't Speak Up in the Moment, explores where some of these patterns around your voice began. And episode 22, Is It Really Peace If It Costs You Yourself? It builds on what it looks like to move out of those patterns and into something more honest. Together, these conversations start to form a bigger picture around voice, identity, and the kind of peace that doesn't require you to disappear. And if this episode met you where you are, I'd love to invite you to not let it end here. I've built the Healer and Hope Giver website, www.healerhopegiver.com, to be a guided place you can land and explore what resonates most with you. Whether that's continuing through the podcast, spending time in the devotionals, or working through some of the companion resources, there are different pathways depending on where you are in your own journey. And if you haven't already, I'd love for you to follow the podcast wherever you listen, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or over on YouTube. Subscribing, reviewing, leaving a like, a comment, or even sharing an episode with someone who might need it really does help these conversations reach the people they're meant for. And as always, if something in this stirred a thought or a question, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out through the website or connect with me on social media. And until next time, keep learning who you are beneath what you've learned, and give yourself space to grow into that at your own pace. I'll meet you next time.